Okay, on the far, on your left, is Barry Schwartz. He was the documenting photographer on the Shroud Project back in 1978. And Rebecca Jackson next to him, who is the other half of John Jackson.
And not Barry.
And together they run the Turin Shroud Center here, right in Colorado Springs. And Rebecca is an expert on Jewish burial practices and other things all related to, Jewish stuff as it relates to the Shroud.
Right.
And then John Jackson here is a theoretical physicist, and he is really the organizer of the Shroud of Turin Research Project. We wouldn't have a Shroud Project if it wasn't for John. And lastly, Pete Schumacher, claim to fame with the VP8 image analyzer, and he is an image specialist and an expert in all things three-dimensional as it relates to the Shroud. And I'm Russ Brialt, and I just run around doing lectures on the Shroud and been doing that for 34 years. So there you go. That's all of us. So,
And you're also on our board of directors.
I'm on Barry's board of directors. So, now, how many of you have seen any of the presentations that have been occurred here so far? Yeah. Well, what'd you think? Yeah. They're good. All right. So, So maybe there's fodder. This is a Q&A. So hopefully you came equipped with a couple questions. And we have a microphone right there. So if you have a question, if you'll stand up and come to that microphone and ask away. So is there a question? We have one.
That's a good start.
Before, I don't really have a question. What I'd really like is for each of you just to talk about briefly, like, what you had to do with the Shroud. I know you were there. Those of you that were there, what did you do? What was your function? And for the Jacksons, what's going on in Colorado Springs? We're from Illinois, so we're totally ignorant of what's going on around here. So anything like that. Give us a background of who you are. That might help.
Do you want me to start?
Okay, yeah.
Go, Rebecca, you start.
No, I'll talk last. I want to be inspired by the rest.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump in and say that I was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin Research Project, the team that performed the first and only in-depth scientific examination of the Shroud ever done in its history. And the team was founded by John Jackson. So he's my mentor in this respect. Since then, of course, continued working with the Shroud. In 1996, I built Shroud.com, which is now the largest and the oldest website on the subject, top of all the search engines. And about 5 years ago, we formed the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, a 501c3 nonprofit. And I pledged over the ownership of all the photography I made in '78 and all the other collections from other team members who have passed away and left them to me over to our nonprofit to preserve them so that in future research, people won't have to start from scratch. Between the website and our archives, basically what we have is kind of a definitive resource on the internet for the Shroud. There are many other websites that are excellent ones. We've linked to probably 100 of them or more. But our primary goal is to collect and review and archive all the best material on all points of view, not just pro-Shroud or anti, but both, so that people can have access to the science that's been done and ultimately and hopefully make up their own minds about the Shroud.
Okay.
Okay, you go.
Me?
Yeah.
Moi?
Yeah.
I'm Russ Brialt, and I run around the country doing lectures on the Shroud of Turin. And my main website is called shroudencounter.com, and I'm incorporated as the Shroud of Turin Education Project with a 10-word mission statement: advancing the knowledge of the Shroud to a new generation. Because if you go onto a college campus right now and ask 100 kids if they've ever heard of the Shroud of Turin, you might get 5 that will raise their hands and say that they've actually heard of it. So there is a literal a dearth of information about it out there. What are we going to do? We have to pass the torch of information to the next generation, and so that's what I try to do. And so there you go. That's it. Pete? Or no, John. John, here we go. Pete.
Okay. I'm part of Serendipity. I was the production manager for a company in Lawrence, Kansas called Interpretation Systems Incorporated. And in 1976, I delivered a VP8 image analyzer to John Jackson and Eric Jumper. And they had this image they wanted to see on this VP8 image analyzer. And they kept pushing me to do that. Well, I was trying to tell them, hey, look, guys, as soon as I'm done showing you how to use this machine, I'm going to be gone, and you won't see me anymore. I'm pretty sure God was laughing at that point. So I haven't left the Shroud since. They had a picture of the Shroud. We put it onto this machine that I had been building in Interpretation Systems in Lawrence, Kansas, delivering them all over the world. And it did something with this image they had that I had not seen on any other image processed through that machine, and that is that it came out 3D by its brightness. And since then, it's been a relationship with John and Shroud of Turin Research Project. I was not one of the members that went over to Turin, Italy. I did help with some of the technical information and so on, especially regards imaging, but that was it. Since then, however, I've retired, and I know I'm retired because I have 2 jobs and neither one of them pay, okay? I'm a deacon in the Catholic Church. The Shroud has had a profound impact on my life, to say the least. And wound up with a Shroud exhibit and museum in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And that was not planned as part of our retirement. The space is donated by a gentleman who happens to be Baptist and runs the mall. That space is 1,900 square feet, lights and heat and everything, for 5.5 years now. And the person that introduced me was a member of the Episcopal faith and became an Episcopal deacon after his encounter with the Shroud. We call our little Shroud exhibit an occasion of grace in a secular place. We're in a shopping mall, of all places. None of this was planned. None of it was part of a strategy for retirement or anything. Everybody there is volunteer. We are a 501c3, and absolutely nobody is paid there to work there. Everything that we do is all by donation. And we have a wonderful website called shroudnm.com. Moved by another person who is a volunteer and donates his time to do all of that, and he is becoming a deacon in the Catholic Church. We have another deacon in the Catholic Church. We had a pastor in the Episcopal Church. We have a young man from the Church of the Nazarene. It's it's quite across the board, and just has taken on a life of its own. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing, and it's related to New Mexico history, but I'll let that for another story, another time.
Well, New Mexico plays a part in the history of the Shroud because quite a number of our team members were from Los Alamos and from Sandia Laboratories. And Air Force Weapons Lab, they're down there too, aren't they? So, I mean, there's
It was our space and weapons programs
Yeah.
from the 1970s, basically.
Whole bunch of our
people were
guys.
from that because of the networking that was done by John and Eric and some of their friends, so.
Okay, John, you're up.
Do I need
No,
to go there?
you go first. You go
I was
first.
kind of hoping she would go.
No.
I was hoping that she would go, so that'll make me not have to talk as much. 'Cause she'll okay. All right. Well, since I have the concurrence of my better half here, I'll go say a few words here. We both are part of our own organization now called the Turin Shroud Center of Colorado. It has 2 missions. The first mission is research on the Shroud. We have our own Shroud lab, and so we can do various experiments. Say we want to do one on image formation and test various hypotheses with respect to that. We can do so. The problem is you want to design your experiments so that they will predict outcomes that you can tie into the Shroud. Well, there's 2 ways you could do that. One, you go to the Shroud itself, which is very difficult to do these days. The other way to do it is because of our work with Stirrup. Stirrup characterized the image on the Shroud in various ways, and so we have this data either originals or some copies of it, which we can then tie into with our experiments. If we design our experiments cleverly enough, then we don't have to go to the Shroud because we can test our hypotheses on data that's already been acquired by the Stirrup expedition of 1978. The other part of what we do, which has been really taking hold quite a bit of our time, is education. And for us, that's to talk about the Shroud from our point of view, based upon the research of our organization. We will also bring in research that we think is credible, and put that into the education program too. We can do this on site here, Colorado Springs. We have our own presentation center. I was actually there the last 3 days giving talks to various people, many of whom were from your conference that came over. We can also do this off-site, and when we say off-site, it's wherever we're invited or sponsored to go. We can go and give presentations. It could be a talk. We have now a full seminar program. It's 15 seminars. They're about 2 hours apiece, all computer PowerPoint based, and we can talk about various topics on the Shroud, the Stirrup expedition, the image formation, some history, et cetera, et cetera. The way we see the Shroud and relating to Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Easter Sunday, et cetera. So those are the two missions that we've set before ourselves. We are also a 501c3 organization, corporation, and we exist on donations and the way a nonprofit organization is supposed to run. Now, I don't run that organization. My better half does here. Rebecca runs the whole thing. She'll get talks organized, and she tells me, honey, you've got a talk here. I do that. That's my military. I was at the Air Force Academy and the faculty there for 4 years. So, I don't know. That's probably enough for now. So, Rebecca, you want to talk?
Yeah, I'm Rebecca Jackson. I'm the Associate Director of Turin Shroud Center. Looks like you said about almost everything I wanted to say. But anyway, I do everything but the science. I came into the Shroud a little late in 1990. But I spent most of my life studying Jewish culture, and I was raised Orthodox Jewish, so that's what I've been doing. I've been doing Jewish research, first century general economic research. What was the economic scene like in the first century in the Mediterranean corridor? And as far as even China or India, it was a very holistic society during the first century. But anyway, so if anybody wants to come to the exhibit to see our presentation center, please talk to me, and let's see what we could arrange for you.
One more thing I just remembered. When we were doing our work with Stirrup, one of my main jobs or responsibilities, I was president of Stirrup at the time of the expedition, was to take care of this guy over here.
By the way,
Just to keep him in line,
no, this spring they're going to show the Shroud of Turin in Turin, Italy, and I know both we and I know Barry are leading tours to Turin. So if anybody's interested in asking, and it's
April 19th through June 24th next year.
yeah, and we're going
in Turin.
June 5th through the 16th. For us, it was basically to Italy, so anybody, our website is shroudofturin.com. That's it. And his is shroud.com.
Okay, go ahead.
Ready for questions?
Sure.
I'd like to see by a show of hands from the panel, who believes the shroud is the garment that covered Jesus' body? All 5 of you, okay. The only thing I know about the shroud is what I read in a National Geographic article about 15 years ago.
June 1980.
Okay, and were any of you consulted on that or work on that? And is there anything to be, would anyone like to comment about the conclusions of that article, especially those, I guess, that consulted on it.
Well, I was happy because as a professional photographer, to get your work in National Geographic was always a dream. And within 6 months, I was in Life magazine, National Geographic, Time, Newsweek, and all that. So I stopped being a still photographer and went into video. I reached all my goals. But, but the National Geographic article, Ken Weaver, that was the science editor of National Geographic, and they participated. Did they contribute a little money?
Not as far as I know.
You know what it was?
I think they contributed some
When-
camera lights, I think, didn't
When
they? Flash.
And they allowed us to use their 8x10 camera, large format camera Vern Miller used that belonged to Victor Boswell Jr. of National Geographic, a staff photographer there. So they did consult us, and the reason I thought about the money is when they published my photographs in Geographic, I had them donate the money to STIRP. So the money would go to STIRP, and I think the same with Life magazine as well. It's not that much money, but still, it was something. So the Geographic article was a milestone in the world of the Shroud. It brought credibility to a topic that had been very controversial for decades, centuries, and I think it brought to the forefront the fact that there was enough interest in this and enough factual information to make a lot of people kind of take pause and think about it again, those perhaps that had dismissed it early on, as I did. I'm Jewish too, and when they asked me to be on the team, I said, no, I don't want to be on that team. But apparently God had other plans. God knew what I would be capable of, but not for another 20 years. God reveals things on a need-to-know basis, apparently. So, but I'm still here.
Can I just ask, what year was that National Geographic release?
June of 1980.
That's what I thought, yeah.
And December of '79 for the Life. I'll
It's-
never forget either of those.
It's the National Geographic is the one with the baby and the baboon
On the cover.
on the
yeah.
cover.
Yeah,
In a bathtub, a little bowl.
Yeah.
yeah.
I think Mary gave a good talk at the Florida Prophecy Conference, wasn't it? Is that where you,
Oh, me?
yeah.
I was here last year and spoke.
Oh, it was here, okay.
Here.
Yeah, that was real good.
Thank you.
Decades ago, I saw something called the Odessa cloth. Is
Odessa,
that
yeah.
actually the shroud? I think at the time
Was
they
it-
tried to say it was something different, so.
Mendelian? is the-
Yeah, there's another name for it, the Odessa cloth, or the Mendelian.
Yeah.
It's
In Odessa, Turkey.
It's generally referred to as the Sudarium of Oviedo.
I think they were talking about the Odessa.
No,
So
they're
you
talking
think-
about the Odessa. EDESA.
That would have been the Mendelian.
Oh, okay, okay.
It's not that place in Texas, that's Odessa.
Edessa. Turkey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're saying it's something different than the.
Well,
shroud?
some people believe that the Odessa cloth, that was described as the Odessa cloth, is in fact the shroud. Historians are still debating that.
Some king had it, right? Or
King Abgar.
Abgar, yeah. Very good.
And then you mentioned that that's going to be on display next year, and I just wondered, is any scientific team going to study it then?
No, not this time. We're all hoping for that at some point in the future, but you can tell by looking at us. John and I were both about 32 or 33 years old in 1978. We were the youngsters on the team, even though he was the founder. Now we're the old-timers. And so that's why Russ and I lecture a lot to universities and young people, trying to get younger people involved to be able to hopefully carry the work further, as Russ mentioned earlier.
So, go ahead.
Well, I'll ask 3 questions and sit down. So my first question, I guess, is to Barry, has there been an increase in hits to the website? Is the world getting more interested in this?
Last count, we're over 15 million visitors, which isn't bad for just a little homebrewed website, which isn't so little anymore after 19 years. But yeah, there's always just a steady increase in traffic. And I will say this, last year was the first time I spoke here at an evangelical conference. And since then, I've been invited to Methodist, Lutheran, Messianic, and evangelical churches around this country. And so I think that once people are better informed, especially my Protestant friends, who always viewed this as a Catholic relic and kind of poo-pooed it, to find out that, yeah, it's the property of the, not technically the church, but of the living pope since 1985. Before that, it was been in private hands for 600 years. So, I don't know, did I answer your question?
Yes. Second question, when this first came out a couple decades ago, I heard lots of arguments about carbon dating, and this was really only from the year 1100. Can you tell me if we've resolved that scientifically?
I guess I'll take that
Yeah,
one.
take that one, John.
Okay, everybody, get yourselves comfortable, put your feet up, and
Easy, John, easy. I'll get the liquid nitrogen, we'll drip it on your head. Keep you cool.
for those of you who needed a little update on this, in 1988, the Shroud was subjected to radiocarbon analysis. I don't like to use the word dating because the fundamental thing that radiocarbon dating does, it's a physics measurement, is to measure the ratio of a radioactive carbon called carbon-14 to carbon-12. And then you measure the ratio of that, and then that's an analysis. That's a measurement that you make, and that's the fundamental measurement. Now, the dating part of it is that if two assumptions are valid, you can then make a calculation to say what's the date, the age, the calendar date of the sample that you've measured. The first assumption is that you have to know, excuse me, you have to believe that you know the initial amount of carbon-14 to carbon-12 that's in that sample, that was in that sample. You can't make that measurement, you have to assume it by some scientific logic. The only way you could make a measurement like that on that sample, what was the initial amount, was to have a time machine go back, make that measurement, come back. Obviously not possible. The second assumption is that nothing has intervened by whatever mechanism to change the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12. If you can verify for yourself and to others that you want to present your result to, that was indeed the case, then yes, your carbon-14 dating actually becomes a reality for the sample, and you can claim that you've measured the actual date of this shroud. The real question then becomes, well, what do you do with a date that comes out to be 14th century? Because if that's true, if that's a valid date, then the shroud could not possibly be the burial cloth of Jesus. Well, in my mind, from a scientific perspective, you really have to have some reason to challenge that date. It was done by 3 laboratories. They treated it like a normal sample. They subjected it to their particular standard cleaning procedures and did what they did. The sample came from a corner piece on the shroud. Now, if you have a basis, a reason for thinking that this date does not square with other pieces of science, because let's face it, the best thing you can do in science is to have multiple pieces of science, and you would like to, and in fact, you really should insist, if possible, to have all pieces of science, of good science, come together and be consistent with one another. That is not the case with the shroud. There are various archaeological, historical pieces of data that would argue that the shroud was in existence before the 14th century date ascribed to it by the radiocarbon measurement. So on that basis, to the extent that those arguments are valid, you can then have a basis for then challenging either the archaeological historical data or the radiocarbon date. My PhD is in physics, so the radiocarbon date ought to be my test, right? But I am actually persuaded by some archaeological historical work, some of which we've done here at our own Shroud Center. We don't have time to get into it here. And there's other pieces of information that's indicate that this shroud existed before the radiocarbon date. So therefore, I am persuaded that we need to look at that radiocarbon date directly. Are there ways in which one of those two assumptions could be invalidated? One way is you can do it by contamination. Contamination does not really work in this case. If it's just coming from people handling it, you can do calculations, and those will only change the radiocarbon date maybe by factors of plus or minus 10, 20 years, and that's about it. We've got 14 centuries to account for. But if the radiocarbon date has indeed erred, as it seems to be from, and I think it did, because of the archaeological historical data, then it's not going to be simple contamination. It's going to be some type of a major effect that has changed the radiocarbon date. Some people have said, well, maybe it's there's a reweave that's been accomplished on the corner where the shroud was taken, the sample was taken from. I would be the first to applaud that if it made sense relative to data that we have from Stirrup. But it doesn't. If you were to look at, for example, the radiographic data, where we took x-rays of the shroud or the transmitted light imagery, if there was a reweave by a sample that was, or maybe a repair, whatever, to the corner where the radiocarbon sample was taken, we ought to see in either one or both of these X-ray transmitted light data, we ought to see subtle variations of the opacity or the density where this sample was spliced into there, much less the problem of how do you get this sample in there in the first place and have it tightly woven into the structure of the cloth itself, which is a whole nother issue. We don't see this in either one of those pieces of data, so I am, until otherwise shown, I am of the conclusion that that is not a viable hypothesis, although, like I say, if it was, I'd be the first to applaud it. There are several, not time here to go through all of these, but my favorite, the one where I feel that it's, if you're going to put your limited resources and funding against, it's one where you have, in the atmosphere, we have carbon monoxide as one of the carbon-containing components. It turns out, and I don't think this was really that well known at the time of the 1988 dating, carbon monoxide is heavily enriched in radiocarbon. I mean, heavily enriched. We're talking in numbers like 600% enriched. To go 2,000 years, you only need 18%. So you can see this is a big deal. Because of that high enrichment, if only about 2% of the carbon from carbon monoxide is able to find its way, maybe over centuries, into the main part of the cloth, just 2% contamination, which is not much, you can make a first century cloth look like a 14th century cloth. And you can see that from calculations of the radiocarbon. So I could go on for, but I think these other fellows have a lot to say too, and I don't want to monopolize it. But that's the only way I know how to answer that question responsibly.
Well, I'd like to throw something in here about the radiocarbon dating process that went on in 1988 that ultimately led to the date that we were given. 3 laboratories were selected to be given the samples, and the irony is, having been a member of the Stirrup team, having spent 17 months before we went to Italy planning every facet of every experiment, if you see the videotape of them planning to remove a sample from the shroud for carbon dating, they argued for an hour and a half over where they were going to take the sample to begin with. And then I'm going to jump to the process at the end of the whole event when they announced the news that the radiocarbon dating of the shroud proved it was a fake, which is what they said, which, by the way, is not what radiocarbon dating proves. They immediately made the announcement, and then Oxford University, one of the 3 laboratories that did the testing, received an anonymous 1 million pound contribution. £1 million in 1988 was 2.4 million Americans, a lot of money. By today's standards, like $5 million, a lot of money. That was given to the Oxford lab, and the irony of the whole process from my point of view is the man who was selected from the British Museum to oversee the entire radiocarbon dating process, Dr. Michael Tite, once the carbon dating was done and the £1 million was delivered to Oxford, Michael Tite left the British Museum, and that money bought him a nice chair at Oxford. So I'm telling you that, not saying there was a conspiracy, but this is a matter of public record, but the public doesn't seem to get this information very much, so we've included it on our site and in some of my lectures. So the whole process of the radiocarbon dating, I hate to say it, was somewhat suspicious in the end when you look at the fact that they still are unwilling to release their raw data to this day. And you know, the beauty of science is that it's open, and the whole concept is you publish your data and others can look at it, and if they find mistakes or flaws, that's how peer review works.
And Barry, not to mention the fact that they had videotaped the actual cutting of the sample, but when it came time to actually deposit the samples into the individual vials, conveniently that part was not videotaped.
They left the room for 30 minutes.
So we have no idea what was actually deposited into the vials that went to the individual labs. Now again, we're not saying that it's foul play, but it certainly leaves open that question. That combined with the $5 million gift to the museum. I'd like to mention something that was released last year. I think it's very interesting. There's a fellow Shroud researcher his name is Giulio Fanti, and he's with Padua University. So here we are 26 years past carbon dating, which was done in 1988, and even though we have reason to suspect that there's something wrong with that date, there's been no attempt to carbon date it again. So if you're going to come up with another date, maybe we can find kind of a circuitous route to date it in another fashion. And so some researchers at Padua University were collecting samples of linens of a known age from the current era, 1,000 years old, 2,000 years old, piece of the Masada cloth, all the way back to 3000 BC, which would be 5,000 years old, piece of an Egyptian mummy cloth. They had about a dozen samples, and they assessed the rate of chemical decay of all these other known linens, and then now let's develop a plot line of predictable chemical decay, and then now let's take a look at a shroud sample and see where it fits into this plot line. And using 3 different tests, they determined that the cloth had a date range of 280 BC to 220 AD. So again, that's just one measure, but now it's a question of who's right and who's wrong. And as John said, there is plenty of historical data to indicate that the shroud certainly has a history predating, the date range given by the carbon dating labs was 1260 to 1390. Well, we know for a fact that it was in Constantinople in 1204 and was stolen during the Fourth Crusade. Well, that's already older than the oldest carbon date. And it didn't just get there in 1204, it had been there for hundreds of years. And so we have every reason to suspect that something is wrong with the carbon date. What specifically? Maybe we'll never know.
How long is this session? I want to know that before I start.
Well,
let me say, John brought up some very interesting points there, and of course my background is image processing, remote sensing. We have from the 1978 investigations a color-separated quad mosaic image of the shroud, and the area from which the sample was taken has a different spectra than the rest of the cloth. We also found, in looking recently at X-ray radiography of the shroud that was taken in '78, that there appears to be a way of we might be able to reverse or translate the patterning of the threads in that area of the shroud. We're just getting started on that. So we're just at the tip of the iceberg on that research in Alamogordo. So I get this question a lot in the museum. And so it dawned on me one day, you know, what are we trying to prove? So I have this little story I'm going to share with you. It didn't really happen. But what if, you know, we were looking at the shroud and all of us got together and we said, hey, wait a minute, did you see that bump in the cloth? How did we miss that? So we get everybody together, we go to Turin, we take the cloth out of the case, we take the backing cloth off and we find some stitches. How in the world did we miss this? I mean, you know, 24 hours a day for 5 days, 40 scientists, 6,000 pounds of equipment, every different faith and lack thereof, all these different backgrounds of science, all of this stuff. How in the world did we miss that? So we take the stitches out and we reach in there and it's a pocket. And we find a note in the pocket and we get the note translated and it says, enjoy your redemption and your salvation. See you soon. Love, Jesus. Signed Mary's mom, 11 apostles, 40 disciples. This is Jesus at the time of the resurrection. What are we trying to prove? Would you still need faith? You surely would.
Sure.
Because ask somebody who's Islamic, they've heard the name. Ask somebody who's Jewish, they've heard the name. You know, how we believe is a different question. And what we are placing our hopes on here is not some piece of material. It's our faith. So, okay,
Well,
yeah, we should know and we should do the best science we can, and we're trying really hard. There's hundreds of years worth of pollens on that shroud from places we absolutely know it's not been since 1260 to 1390. So no matter what else, there is a problem with the carbon.
Yep.
Next question. I'm done with carbon dating.
He just mentioned about pollen, and I just want to know, how does what we know about the shroud, the pollen, the material, how, you know, how it squares with first century Israel?
Well, the late Dr. Max Frey, who was a Swiss criminologist, but his hobby was palynology. And he did research, and it's in the movie called The Silent Witness, and that's available, of course, on Amazon. And he discovered, by doing research, he used to be a criminologist, and what he did is track criminals through pollens on weapons, et cetera. And he applied the same techniques to the Shroud of Turin, and he found a huge number of pollens of plants that grow in the Jerusalem area and in Israel in general, and also in Asia Minor, where we know the Shroud was. So that's what he did. That's what he did. So we think that it's another reason for authenticity, because these pollens from Middle Eastern plants were found on the Shroud.
Sadly, in 2002, when the Turin authorities decided to restore the shroud, they removed all the patches, they removed the backing sheet, they scraped away all of the char from around the burns, they smoothed out the wrinkles and you applied steam in some areas, and then they vacuumed it. So any future pollen studies, any credible future pollen studies cannot be performed on the shroud. They've completely disturbed that to a point where it would be very restrictive in being able to draw any viable conclusions because of the restoration that was done.
That's the problem with conservationists. You know, while I believe the conservationists have good intentions, but they say the road to hell is based
Paved
on
with good intentions,
yeah, and this seems to be seems to be the case, because the conservation that was done was totally totally inconsiderate. And did not consider, let's put it this way, the science and the history of the shroud that was so important. So they, conflicting interests.
No scientists were involved in the restoration. And for me, being a photographer, one of the saddest things when I saw the shroud in 2010 was the first time I saw it after the restoration of 2002. I was with a group of pilgrims, and I got very emotional when I saw the way the shroud looked, because when they took off the backing sheet, they sewed a newer, whiter, brighter backing sheet onto the shroud, lowering the apparent contrast of the image. And so I stood there with these people who, of course, they didn't have the frame of reference. I spent 5 days and nights with it and photographed it and lit it, so I had this, you know, the pretty good sense of how it was supposed to look. And, of course, the last time they displayed it, they also used digital projectors as light sources because they could control the shape. But those digital projectors put out a very blue, high color temperature light, which cancels out the yellow color of the shroud, and the shroud looked gray and dingy when I saw it. Somebody wrote me before I saw it in 2010 and said, I went to see the shroud, and that can't be the real shroud because that's not the way it's supposed to look. And I sort of ignored that until I got there and realized that the way it was lit and the fact that a lighter, whiter sheet was put behind it has cut the apparent contrast. Any professional photographer will tell you when you're going to copy something that might have some translucency, you put something black behind it, not something white. And unfortunately, when hopefully the lighting will be better and that won't make it look gray because it's actually yellowish. But so there's a lot of things that have been done in recent years that aren't going to necessarily be helpful to scientists in the future. And the pollen, sadly, is one of the victims of that, in that a real professional pollen study, which is done like an archaeological dig, they map it out on a grid and take every little spot, that's not going to be viable because of the disturbance of everything with the vacuuming and the steaming and everything. So
I'd
yeah.
like to add to what Barry just said here, that when you look at conservation, I think the shroud really challenges, probably better than any other object that I can think of, what you mean by conservation. There's conservation as a conservationist would use, and that is you want to conserve the object. You want to do whatever you have to do to conserve the object as a physical object for posterity. But there's another type of conservation that really needs to be looked at, and that is conservation of any scientific information resident in the object. And what you don't want to do is to do conservation just to preserve the physical object and annihilate or destroy or degrade the scientific information that's resident in this object. For example, Barry just brought up something that's a kind of a sore spot with me, and that is the fold marks, the wrinkles that are on this shroud. 1978, I noticed that there were fold lines on this cloth, and they were in a pattern, but we didn't have time to analyze them. It was something that we kind of had not really anticipated properly. So I asked, it was Vern Miller, actually.
Right.
And maybe you helped him out on that, Barry, I don't remember. But the idea was to I asked him, would you at least document these with raking light photographs? So you shine light tangent to the cloth that gives you, by shadow formation, these fold lines.
Right.
What's nice about that is that if you know the direction of the light, you could tell at each fold line which way the cloth has been folded.
That's right.
See? So he did that, and he did it so well that you got all kinds of creases and wrinkles and all that in addition to the fold line. However, it turned out that when we started to begin to look at this, I spent about 20 years looking at these fold lines. I don't want you to think that's what all I did, you know. I get up in the morning and I think, okay, I get my breakfast and I'm going to go study. I'm going to think about fold lines for all the day, and you know, and we're going to do that. I'm going to do that for 20 years. You probably wonder about my sanity. Maybe you are wondering about my sanity right now. That's possible.
You're a physicist.
We always wonder about physics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the problem was that as we kept coming back to this problem of what makes these fold lines and the pattern that we were seeing, I finally think that we have a solution to it. My colleagues agree with me. And this puts the cloth into Constantinople, the cloth itself. And so this is an observation not just from an image to images that you knew were in Constantinople. This is a way to put the cloth right into Constantinople historically. And that's a big deal because the radiocarbon measurement says that the age of the cloth upon which these fold marks are in are too young to have fold marks on it that come demonstrably from Constantinople from comparison of archaeological historical data. So that's kind of a problem. But anyway, one of the things that we did was to look at one of the fold lines that goes right through the 1532 fire intersections. That's interesting because here is a possible way to date or to put a limit on one of the dates of these fold marks. So we had X-rays of the shroud. We X-rayed the whole shroud. Bill Modern and Ron London did that. They, when you look at the intersection, you can see the fold line going right into the brittle, charred, blackened material under the patch. This is in 1978. And the only way that could happen is if that brittle material contained the fold mark before,
It was burned.
it was burned.
Yeah, yeah.
And so therefore, you can say with certainty that fold line predates 1532. Now, how much it predates, that's another question. But you see, in the conservation that Barry talked about, what they did was they removed all the brittle, charred material from all the patches, which obliterated that very subtle intersection of this fold line, this historical fold line, with the cloth itself, with the materials. Thereby, what that does is it denies future generations for themselves going into the shroud and proving for themselves that this fold line really is as old as we believe it is based on our own analyses. The only thing that we've got right now that documents this are these X-rays of stirrup. One last thing. To show this thing about how to do conservation. Suppose you've got a CD, and let's say we're a couple hundred years in the future, maybe 1,000 years or so in the future, and we've got this CD coming from our particular time, and you give it to a conservationist, and what they decide is, well, gee, this is a very historical object that comes from this time period. Let's apply our conservation techniques to it. Let's start cleaning it off. Let's maybe really polishing down the shiny surface of the CD to really make it, make any kind of grime or whatever that maybe accumulate on it. Well, I think you can see where I'm going. You can, in that particular example, and the shroud is, I think, very much close to this, you can obliterate the scientific information or any information in that CD if all you're concentrating on is just to clean it off and to preserve it for future generations. So this is a very big deal, and it's something that really needs to be brought to the attention of future conservationists.
I think Bill Meacham, who's an archaeologist who wrote a book about this, and I think the title of his book says it all. The book was called The Rape of the Turin Shroud, and it was all about the conservation of 2002.
I have to interject one thing. Dr. Alan Adler was a member of our team, one of the other Jewish members of our team, as a matter of fact. He was a blood chemist. And in one of the papers that I believe we published on Shroud.com, Adler said, regarding the shroud and its conservation, that the shroud is both an image and a cloth, and until both are understood, neither could be conserved properly. So what Al was saying was, don't mess with it. Let's try and figure these things out before we mess with it. But unfortunately, he had passed away by then. And sadly, they even used some of his words as an excuse for going ahead and doing this restoration. And I'm sure Al was spinning in his grave. So,
I always, at the museum, I explain that what you're looking at when you look at an image of the shroud is anatomically, physically, medically, metabolically, chemically, in every possible way, a perfect image and evidence of a person who's been tortured and crucified as Jesus was. It's not just the image, and we tend to focus on the image. It is image and evidence. This is like something that was really, truly present at the crime scene. The blood's real blood. The pollens are real pollens. The image is on the front that's only from the front. The image is on the dorsal that's only on the dorsal. That if it's done by radiation, the radiation had to come from inside, if that's the case, if you want to take that tack. The bottom line is that there are things that are evidence there just as we would have with a crime scene. To do what was done with it in 2000 is to really ignore the fact that this is evidence from basically a crime scene, a murder.
And who ever heard of remodeling a relic? I mean, maybe a painting, that needs to be restored, the Sistine Chapel. Sure, over the hundreds of years, gets dirty, you go and you restore it. But a relic?
Yeah.
Even though I know many of you are not much into relics, but to those to whom relics are important, I mean, to me, it was, I didn't want to write the word desecration on shroud.com, but that's what I was thinking when this was done.
When you think of if the shroud is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus, then it would also be his resurrection cloth as well, according to the understanding of Christianity. You could think of it as, in the religious sense, as a relic, but from a scientific perspective, the way we will look at this is that the shroud, and I attribute this to my colleague, Dr. Keith Propp, a 25-year volunteer to help us work on the shroud at our Shroud Center, that you can think of the shroud as an archaeological site on cloth of where Christianity began. And so what do you do with an archaeological site? You excavate it. You use scientific techniques to excavate it in a methodical manner. But what you don't do is to walk in there and say, okay, what we're going to do, we've got an archaeological site, and we're going to conserve it. We're going to take care of this thing so it looks just as pristine as possible. What sense is that?
They don't do any of the Egyptian antiquities. So
No.
they wouldn't dare do it.
Yeah.
I think we just have a couple more minutes before our time is up. So does anyone have one more question?
3, it looks like.
Mine isn't a real quick question. I know you didn't have multispectral film and cameras and CCDs back then, but...
Actually, we did, but they weren't very sensitive.
Okay. That's part of my question. What was the spectrum that they could ascertain? And what I'm getting at with that, were there EMF studies done? Did you have the equipment then available to do that?
What kind of study?
EMF, magnetic and
Yeah.
whatnot.
Oh.
Not just radiographic,
No.
not just light, but were there any studies done that could ascertain characteristics of the energy that would have been there, that would have left that image? I've heard some comments about it being like a laser and whatnot, but getting to the magnetic properties of the fibers themselves and getting into that energy that did that, it resurrected that body, might not have rejuvenated some of the fibers of the linen and have any such tests?
I'll give you the Jewish answer, and then John can give you the scientific answer. Resurrection, no one witnessed the event. There is no scientific characteristic of the resurrection event. So I always say that resurrection's a test of faith, not science.
We
John,
haven't been able to duplicate it in the lab yet. We're
yeah,
working.
no one's ever duplicated the properties of the image. Was that a good enough answer?
Pretty good for you, Barry.
For me, thanks, John.
From a Christian point of view, the resurrection, say a few words about that. And by the way, I don't have any problem with science and faith, as long as we properly understand what science does and what faith does, religion does. Science asks questions of who, what, when, where, and how. Religion asks the why question. Science can't touch why questions.
right.
And religion is not designed to deal with how the physical world operates. If we understand that, we're never going to have a conflict here between science and religion. It's only when science tries to do what religion is designed to do, or when religion tries to do what science is going to do. That's where your conflict comes. But anyway,
You said that way better than I did.
thank you, Barry. I appreciate that.
Looking like a true.
Your stock just went up a little bit, not a lot,
you.
but just.
Well,
The Christian idea of the resurrection, true. Nobody ever claimed to have witnessed it. But maybe a simple cloth wrapping the body did in its own way.
no.
Theologically, the resurrection is something that happened in space and time, but it also transcended space and time. It didn't. Its ultimate explanation is not recorded in space-time coordinates like physics, but it still happened according to Christian theology, in the context of space and time, to the extent that it did, that the resurrection did occur in space and time. Then something like the shroud could be a viable, reasonable way to approach that space-time sub-characteristic of the whole event. And we have an archaeological site, and I'm talking from a Christian point of view, that if this cloth really did wrap the resurrection itself, I think that's a big deal. That's a big thing that the human race has to deal with, and we can't get this one wrong. I don't know which is worse, to have an authentic shroud thought of as inauthentic or an inauthentic shroud thought of as authentic. They're both bad, but in different ways. So I guess,
Now we got
That's
another
what-
2 questions.
yes.
I like what you just said. I like to say this, people often ask the wrong question. They would say, what if it's not authentic? And my view is, what if it is authentic and we did nothing with it? Which would be the greater sin? You see, because we don't know. I mean, we don't have absolute proof of anything. And so I always say, let's explore the mystery. And as we do, we encounter the message. And here's one thing I know for certain, that the message of the shroud is identical to the Scripture. There is no difference. And so really, it's really about the message to me, so we got a camera person. How much time we have? We're out. Okay.
I'd like to throw one last thought in, because I said this here last year, and I often like to say this to my Protestant audiences particularly. The Shroud of Turin did not come with a book of instructions, and the answer to faith is not on a piece of cloth, but in the eyes and hearts of those who look upon it.
I guess we're done, but we could take the questions if we can have the hall.
You can stay, but I gotta go. So
He's got to go give another
See you
talk.
guys
And you say it's
later.
next door?
Do you know where we're going?
Huh?
Do you know where we're going?
No, are you gonna?
We're gonna go to Dean's.
We're going to follow.
Where is it?
I've got the instructions.
Hang on,
I'll
we're
get it
working
to you
out our
before you
dinner
leave.
plans
Where are
right
you gonna
now.
be?
I'm gonna go present at 5.
Russ
That's
has to
right,
go
we-
give a
we
talk
won't be
right
there,
now.
so-
So you're gonna be there?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
What time, you start at 5, you're in the main auditorium for this one?
In the main auditorium.
All right, cool.
Guys in the details, 5 o'clock, right here, main auditorium.
We'll stay.
Are we okay to sit here, or do they need the room?
At 5. We've
Oh,
got 20 minutes or
so we got a little time yet, we can continue. Okay.
Yes.
Well, in listening to your presentation and everything, the real bugaboo in the whole thing seems to be the carbon dating. Everything else seems to be very straightforward.
Isn't that
That's the
interesting?
only real portion people argue about.
That's right.
Okay. The shroud would be an evidence of the resurrection, and that's what you're studying. However, there is the Sudarian. Now, that is not a resurrection or evidence of the resurrection, but yet that is a cloth that, if it is, according to the forensic stuff, comparing this blood thing to this blood thing and the shroud and all that, couldn't that be carbon dated?
It was.
They did carbon date.
They
We
did.
did 3 expeditions on the Sudarium of
Oh, they did.
Oviedo.
What'd they come up there?
What did they come up with?
You're not gonna like the date. It was about 7th century.
7th century.
Really? Okay.
Yeah,
It's earlier than the shroud, but not,
Carbon 14
But you
and
see-
linen
But you see,
not get along.
if you take this idea that carbon monoxide, which is enriched in the atmosphere, that unarguably could have, affected it too, depending upon what the circumstances of each cloth is. So there's a possibility that that's where you get your explanation.
What about the physics of the resurrection itself? Could that actually affect the carbon?
Well,
You know what
yeah, I
mean?
do.
That's just impossible.
We don't know that
How it
physics,
was
do we?
done, but it's-
We don't know that physics, so how,
So it's impossible to.
But-
can't use that.
analyze.
but then you could also, if you look at this cloth and have more, we only had 5 days round the clock.
And you only got one
With the
piece,
shroud.
correct? There weren't multiple samples, just the one.
You're talking about the radiocarbon dating?
Yeah.
Yeah, they only took one little piece.
One
That one-
corner.
okay, okay.
There are
Okay,
some
cut
very
it up.
interesting things regarding the sample. You can look at the corner where it was taken from. There was a Ross sample that was taken in 1973. That piece of the shroud was covering up the backing cloth. And you can see that what it was covering up was protected by the shroud. In other words, the backing cloth is cleaner underneath where the Ross sample was removed from
Yeah.
than it is where the backing cloth is fully exposed immediately adjacent to the place where the Ross sample and the carbon dating sample were taken. So, there are so many questions about this. I can say only one thing. Thank God that we have the data that was collected in 1978.
It's shrunk,
Those
isn't it?
photographs, all of those things, the multispectral, composite color, top light, backlight, raking light, thermal infrared, near infrared, ultraviolet fluorescence, X-ray fluorescence, multispectral composite color images. Not all of it, unfortunately, is accessible to all the scientists, unfortunately. Is that true? I think that's a true statement.
All the data was published.
Two cuttings on that shroud, the one you all did, and then one.
We didn't cut it. That was done by a completely different group of people.
Is it still around?
That sample?
Yeah.
Well, each lab got a piece.
No, not
And there's a
yours. I mean
reserve.
the other one, the older one. The raw. Yeah.
The Reyes
The
sample.
Ross sample.
Yeah.
The Ross sample was explored by, in part, by Ray Rogers.
Ray Rogers, yeah.
No,
And every-
Race. Well, Ray Rogers to some
Yeah.
extent, but it was taken by Race.
Yeah,
R-A-E-S.
Race, yeah, RAES.
Did all that
There's some interesting information on that. There's way too long to discuss that here, but you can get that on Barry's site, expect on John's site, my
Would the fire
site.
have affected the carbon dating itself?
Was that?
Quite
Carbon
probable.
residue, from the smoke and all that, wouldn't that?
Well, yeah.
To some extent.
Here's the problem. Here's the problem
Probably
with
not
with
enough.
contaminations like this. That when you contaminate, you're not contaminating with pure carbon-14. You're always contaminating with a ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12.
Okay.
And so when you put carbon-14 in that could make the cloth look younger, you're also adding carbon-12 that comes along with it. It just happens, it just comes along with it.
But in the
And so,
fire-
and so the point is, to really make a difference, depending upon what the enrichment of the contaminant is, you have standard contaminations that even if it was modern, like put on today, you would need the calculation is you need almost twice as much carbon mass in the contamination that you have in the carbon of the sample of the shroud in order to move the radiocarbon date from 1st century to 14th century. I mean, if the shroud had that kind of contamination on, it would stand up by itself.
We'd
It'd be-
see
it'd be
it,
so
yeah.
over.
Which we may. Anyway, yes. I'm sorry, was that your last question, or?
Yeah, no, that was.
He pretty much asked what I was going to about the scenario, what kind of testing has been done on that, and has that kind of been compared to the shroud, let's say the DNA, I mean, there's gotta be DNA on
Oh.
the barium, DNA on the shroud.
Well, let me talk for a minute about DNA then.
Okay,
Okay, first of all, it's only in recent years that we've discovered that we're constantly shedding massive quantities of our DNA just from epithelial cells. That means that if we did an examination of the shroud for DNA, we'd find John Jackson's DNA and my DNA and every nun and every priest and every bishop and anybody else who's ever touched it, breathed on it, leaned over it, or kissed it, okay? So DNA being a comparative analysis, do you happen to have a DNA profile of Jesus? No.
No, but we could compare.
You could compare it to other
Siderian.
things. The real question is, are you comparing a contaminated sample, or is it the actual raw sample that was there on the shroud originally? And somebody suggested recently, Kelly Kearse, who's a DNA and blood expert, in a paper that's on our site, he just suggested that if they separated the backing sheet again, the blood soaked through, and the blood on the back side of the sheet has had far less exposure to contamination from handling. So perhaps that kind of comparison could be made. But a lot of people there have been fiction stories and movies about cloning the Antichrist from the shroud. You need a complete profile for that kind of stuff, and that's not going to happen. So that's the reason I brought it up in that manner.
Can I ask just from a cultural point of view, why was the head cloth taken off, set aside in the grave, and just the shroud left on Jesus' body? Do you know why? It's apparently
Two different functions.
Well, they had to prepare the body for burial. The face cloth was put on when they brought him off the cross, carried him to the tomb. Then that would have been removed for preparation of the burial.
Yeah, they didn't want to lose any of the blood.
But they couldn't lose the blood, and that's why in the Gospels it says that it was folded and separate from the other, but
Yeah.
it's there because it's Jewish law that it be buried with the body.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't violate anything in the Old or New Testament. It's right on the money.
Tell them why that, tell everybody why
The blood is
that blood is important.
The blood is
To keep it
considered
with the-
a part of the life.
The life
blood-
force.
Life source, the lifeblood, and you have to collect everything. Yeah, just like in the movie by Mel Gibson.
Yeah.
The passion.
It looks Jewish. It looks Jewish when you have this bloody sudarium sitting right next to the shroud, according to the Gospels. I mean, once you realize that, the whole thing looks Jewish,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah,
from a
it's
Jewish
very
burial.
very consistent.
Did all that restoration not damage the image?
No.
No, I think the only harm to the image, it wasn't physically to the image more, but to the apparent contrast of the image by putting a much wider cloth behind it. And here's something I didn't mention before that I'll throw in at this last minute here. No one did any chemical analysis of the new cloth to determine if it had been treated in any manner that might be harmful over long term to the shroud, and it's already been there for 12 years.
Like storing photographs of stuff?
Exactly. So,
And there, it turns out there are subtle features on the back side of the shroud, not the least of which is a very subtle image on the reverse side of the shroud. It's considerably more subtle than you see on the frontal side. And like what Barry says, if you're taking a cloth and you're going to expose it to something here that who knows what it might do, there's an example where your conservation might be degrading the
object.
actual object itself with information on it that's valuable to us.
Right.
Didn't the shroud shrink, though? I had heard that they shrunk from.
No.
No.
When they finished the, well, they didn't steam clean it, let me be clear about that. They steamed areas that were heavily creased to smooth out the creases. Okay, so they didn't steam the entire cloth, but according to the people who did the work, when they finished, the cloth was approximately 7 centimeters longer than it was before they began.
Oh, it actually lengthened.
Yeah, because they got rid of the wrinkles.
They smoothed the creases out, it got longer.
What became of the backing cloth?
They stashed it somewhere, they have it.
Probably at the
Archdiocese.
Central, probably.
I think the Archdiocese may have it, just like they have the samples and stuff.
Yeah.
But the Central also has.
Yeah.
Mine actually
At the
had
museum.
what's left of your forensic stuff that was wiped out on the actual shroud itself.
What, say that?
It might have a lot of the pollen things and stuff like that that fell through the weed that are still sitting
Possible.
on the backing cloth that are now missing
Okay.
on the shroud.
Now we're getting kicked out. All right, well, thank you very much, folks.